One of the panelists was Angelica Navarro, who is Bolivia's chief climate negotiator and a just extraordinary woman. What she has called for is a Marshall Plan for planet Earth. This is what she says: this plan must mobilize financing and technology transfers on a scale never seen before. It must get technology on the ground in every country to ensure we reduce emissions while raising people's quality of life. We have a decade. So what that would mean in practice is that those Indian villages that need to electrify and have a right to electrify would be able to leapfrog over dirty energy sources and go straight to solar, but that costs money. And that's just one example. There are thousands. But the sums that we're talking about are big. There isn't actually any consensus, any agreement about what the sums would be. Bolivia has been, which has really been leading this at the governmental level, has been very careful actually not to name a figure. But the United Nations did some research into this, into what it would cost for this leapfrogging and also the cost of mitigation, and it's around $600 billion a year, which sounds a lot, but not when you compare it to the bank bailout. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that unlike that transfer of wealth from public coffers to the hands of the banks, this is not a zero-sum game. We all benefit from avoiding catastrophic climate change, since it's actually no fun living inside a green zone surrounded by a sea of raging red. Paying our climate debts and being part of this global process of repair, making it more balanced economically and ecologically, is not dour punishment. It is, in fact, the most inspiring collective work we could ever hope to undertake. Now, there was a lot of openness to this concept in Copenhagen from a lot of northern NGOs. A lot of Canadians have supported the call, a lot of church-based groups, a lot of European NGOs have signed on. But I'll tell you who really hates the idea of climate debt and reparations, and that's American environmentalists. And I have to tell you, I got quite a few lectures and sort of pleading sessions with people who are literally saying, please stop using the word climate debt, please stop using the word reparations. And one woman actually wrote an article in the Guardian saying, Naomi Klein, well, the headline was, Naomi Klein, please stop making my work harder. And I don't know how hard her work is, but basically the argument is the context in which American environmentalists are working in is so dire, is so awful. Their opposition is Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, who are convinced that, as Abby said, Obama is a raving socialist, and in fact that everything he's doing is part of an elaborate plot to bankrupt the government and pay reparations to African Americans. Now, I'll just give you one, that's actually a Limbaugh quote. So I'll give you a typical comment. This comes from the executive director of the International Rivers Network. He wrote recently on Huffington Post, Sarah Palin, Glenn Beck, and the rest of the American Taliban would surely wet themselves with delight if there was any serious noise from the left calling for billions of dollars in climate reparations for poor countries. So you can see their point, but I want to talk about why these words actually are important. Now, one reason is that these are the words that have been chosen by the Global South. So given that the issue here is that we are destroying ways of life, ecosystems, I'm not sure we should be dictating what words they're allowed to use to describe what's happening to them. I think that the best reason for why we should use these words is that they're true. We have done great damage to the earth and to our fellow human beings, and we must begin the process of healing and repair. Every reparations process in history has begun with an acknowledgement of past wrongs. There are very practical reasons as well. One way or another, billions of dollars are going to be spent in coming years to help countries cope with climate change. We're already hearing pledges of, in Copenhagen they said that they would get $10 billion in emergency financing in the next 3 years, and then the $100 billion would be on the table by the end of the decade. We don't know if that's true or not, but these are the types of figures that are being bandied about. Not recognizing a debt, denying a debt, but saying we're going to help you. It's going to be aid. And this is the problem, because if it's not recognized as reparations, then it is simply aid. And we know the way aid works. Much of it will come in the form of loans, not grants. And much of it will just be a shuffling of the cards. In fact, it will be a stealing of aid money that is currently being spent, say, on schools or on AIDS programs, and it will be moved into climate mitigation. And it will be administered by the usual suspects, in particular the World Bank, which is gunning to be the bank for the Climate Financing Fund. And we know the World Bank administers its aid and the kinds of conditions that come along with it. And to think that they would not do this in the context of climate change is to be woefully naive, because they do it, they've done it, they've already done it. I think I wrote about this in the shock doctrine, using natural disasters to push through unpopular neoliberal policies. It happened after Hurricane Mitch, when Central American countries devastated by that disaster were told that if they wanted any aid, they'd have to privatize their electricity and phone systems. These people have no shame. It's important to remember that. Now, What's happening now, if you've been following the intricacies of the climate negotiations and your eyes haven't completely rolled back in the back of your head, right now we're in the process of seeing which countries will sign on to that dirty deal that was pushed through in the final days of the Copenhagen summit, what's being called the Copenhagen Accord. This was what was pushed through by the US in the dying hours of the summit. And many countries don't want to sign because it erases the whole concept of historical responsibility, and the emission cuts that are on the table are not nearly enough to deal with the climate crisis. They won't get us to 2 degrees. They're more like 4 degrees, as I said. Developing countries are being told that if they don't sign on to the Copenhagen Accord and give up the whole concept of historical responsibility that was embedded in Kyoto, they will get none of that $100 billion on the table. It's naked blackmail, forcing developing countries to choose between a strong, fair deal that stands a chance of averting climate chaos and the funds they desperately need to cope with the droughts and floods that have already arrived. That is why the climate debt frame is important and why it can't be sacrificed in the name of American political pragmatism. If we are paying reparations, our governments come to the table with a little bit of humility, not with the usual swagger and the right to call the shots that they're so used to. On the other hand, the countries receiving the resources come to the table not as perpetual deadbeat debtors looking for another handout, but as creditors with their own claims to make. In fact, the concept of climate debt changes the very concept of who owes whom. It turns the world upside down or right side up, if you stand with Eduardo Galeano. Now, probably more than a few of you at this point in the evening are thinking to yourself, this all sounds very good, but it's never going to happen. And over the past few months, as I've been writing about this issue and speaking about it in North America, I have found a consistent unwillingness to argue the facts, even when dealing with opponents of this concept. Basically, the stance is that it is unrealistic. Not that it's wrong, but that it's completely unrealistic. Or to quote Todd Stern, the chief US climate negotiator, it is untethered to reality. So the message is this: you may have the facts on your side, you may have the arguments, you may be able to quote the treaties, but you lack the power. And debt is always about power. It's about who has the muscle to get their debts collected. That muscle can come in the form of broken knees, if you're in the mob, and it can come in the form of broken countries if you work for the International Monetary Fund. If you have no power, you get no payback, right?